Okay, great.
Yeah, right, brilliant. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much to Barbara and Helen for organising today and for inviting us to speak. As mentioned, yes, we're sort of going to build on a blog post and a meeting that we had a little bit after the food strategy came out. So we spent quite a while actually trying to digest this thing, so the title does make sense because it does take a bit of digesting because it's rather a large document, but obviously it's very important to our work as food geographers and sort of food system analysts, as PhD researchers, as researchers of food systems, but also it's critical for the UK food system in terms of the direction of travel that it's going to be taking in the next few years. So what we thought we'd start with is a bit of policy context, and you might have noticed the title of the slide. We're stealing Tim Lang's book title, basically. But what we thought we'd do, and I think it's quite interesting, is to contextualize the food strategy in a broader sort of historical sense. So what we've done is just identified three key sort of policy moments, if you like, in terms of strategy for food. The first one is to go back to basically World War II, and that period both between the wars and after, a kind of period of sort of self-sufficiency, if you like, and the mode of governance there, we've described it as kind of command and control food defense. In other words, there was the government took a strong lead, and you had things like the beverage food plan, which actually was produced in 36, and then out of that a welfare statement which came in 42. But this period, which then led to the Agricultural Act, was a kind of the beginnings of kind of agricultural productivism in a way, and the whole imperative was to increase food production, increase food security, increase farmer incomes, and create a cheaper food economy. So that's an important period, both in terms of some modes of governance and the sort of what was required. We then jump forward a little bit into the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001, and what came from that, which was Donald Curry's the so-called Curry Commission. And that was quite an important period, and it was in response to a zoonotic disease threat, a threat from our animal economy, if you like. And Sir Don Curry gave a very clear message in that, in terms of the need to basically reconnect our food system, to relocalize our food system, and to address the kind of environmental externalities which the outbreak had exposed. So again, it's quite interesting to observe the messages at that point. Then we have what is basically the food strategy that comes before this one, which was something called Food 2030. It's interesting because again, that came out of the back of a crisis, which was the global recession and the 07-08 commodity spikes. That was the trigger of that. So this was very much kind of new Labour food strategy. And there's some interesting points in there. One is, for example, the fact that you have health and diet coming through much more strongly. So it mentions things like sustainable diet as well as environment. That was actually our last food strategy. So what's happened is that we've had a period without any direction, if you like, over a decade. And amongst that, we've also had all the kind of Brexit uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainties, but we've had a lot of important agricultural policy changes, both in terms of things like the Agriculture Bill and the Environment Bill. So from that perspective, a food strategy review, which some people refer to as the Dimbleby Food Review, which started back in August 2019, is really, really welcome. And it configures in two parts, which Pippa's going to talk about at the moment. But our kind of approach to it really is, it's important to think about the previous strategies that existed, but broadly speaking, we very much welcome it. So what we're going to try and do is approach it as a kind of critical friend, if that's a nice way of putting it, because we have got some some critical comments, which we'll talk about at the end. But what we're going to do first of all is give you an overview of what's in the strategy, both in terms of how those two documents configure and then what's in the recommendations. So I'll pass you over to Pippa now to do all that.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Damian. So as Damian mentioned there were two parts to this latest National Food Strategy. So part one came out back in 2020 and predominantly responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. And its major recommendations were around poverty and around trade, as in the aftermath of Brexit and the negotiation of Britain's sort of trading arrangements going forward. And then in June last year, we got the plan, which was a much more sort of comprehensive document that came to about 289 pages for transforming the food system. And that's what I'm going to go through in a bit of detail just now. So Dimbleby sort of structures his analysis of the food system around sort of two key pillars, and he uses this systems thinking approach to identify feedback loops and traps that we can get into in this complex system that is the food system. And the first of these sort of pillars that he addresses is nicknamed the junk food cycle. So in Dimbleby's own words, that's that we have a predilection for calorie-dense foods, which means food companies invest more time and money creating these foods, which makes us eat more of them and expands the market, which leads to more investment, which makes us eat more. I hope you're all enjoying a nice biscuit with your coffee right now. And yeah, so this sort of speaks to, as Damian alluded to, the sort of increasing rise of productivism, but also convenience foods. And now what we're seeing talked about much more is these ultra processed and hyper palatable foods and the sort of cycle that perpetuates that. So then the second sort of pillar that isn't really a new idea, but is articulated quite nicely in the report, is about the invisibility of nature. And this basically is the idea that's been around for a long time, that we don't put any sort of financial value on nature. So I'll quote the report again. Environmental destruction and climate change impose a huge financial burden on the taxpayer, yet none of this is recorded on our financial spreadsheets. It's not factored into the GDP with which we measure a nation's economic health or the financial statements of our companies. And it's kind of drawing from these two, looking at these two destructive feedback loops, that we then get a set of recommendations that seek to start to address these, although perhaps not in quite as such a transformative way as some of us would have liked, as we'll sort of come to later. And so the recommendations themselves are in four sort of major themes. The observant among you may note that this photo is not England, it's the Scottish borders, but it looks quite nice, so that's why I put it here. So the first theme is about escaping the junk food cycle and protecting the NHS. And the first recommendation is the one that we saw a lot of headlines about introducing a sugar and salt reformulation tax. And this is broadly based on the soft drinks, or the success of the soft drinks industry levy. So it's focused on changing prices for sugar and salt that are going to be added to foods by manufacturers or used in restaurants. So the idea is to encourage reformulation rather than hitting consumers at the point of purchase. And then another component of that is using the revenues to expand schemes that get fruit and vegetables to low-income families who might have less access to those. So the other two components of this theme are to introduce mandatory reporting for large food companies, and that's defined as companies with over 250 employees, and launching a new Eat and Learn initiative for schools, which is quite multifaceted, but major components are introducing sensory learning for preschool children to encourage them to try different foods, and then also reinstating the food A-level and upskilling more teachers to be able to provide high quality education around food. And of course, if we need to go into any of these in more depth at the end, just let us know if I went over it too quickly. So the second theme is about reducing diet-related inequality. And a major recommendation is extending the eligibility for free school meals after year 2. So currently the threshold to be eligible is an annual income of, I think it's 7,400 before benefits, and they're talking about increasing that up to 20,000. And that will allow, I think it's by their projections, that will make sure that it reaches 82% of children who are at very high risk of food insecurity. So the following recommendation is about funding the holiday activities and food programme for the next 3 years. This is what was in the headlines and which Marcus Rashford campaigned on. So we'll all be quite aware of that. Number 6 is about expanding the Healthy Start scheme, which is broadly to do with vouchers for pregnant people and families on low incomes with young children, to make sure that they have increased their access to healthy foods. And then recommendation 7 is kind of aimed at all age groups. The previous 3 are very much focused on prioritising children in these efforts to reduce inequality. But the final one is about trialling these community Eat Well programmes, so supporting community care partnerships to design programmes that work in their community to do things like fruit and vegetable prescribing, education and activities around food for people who are at risk of diet-related ill health. And now the third theme is around agriculture, and it's called Make the Best Use of Our Land. So recommendation number 8 is about guaranteeing the budget for agricultural payments until at least 2029. So this is as the CAP payments are phased out now that we've left the EU, and as we phase in the environmental land management schemes, it's making sure that the budget is guaranteed so that there's not a deficit for farmers in between those two. So that they've got time to transition to more sustainable land use in ways that means that they can get paid under the new scheme. Recommendation 9 is about creating a rural land use framework based on the 3-compartment model. I'll describe that in a bit more detail in a few slides. And then number 10 is about defining minimum standards for trade. Now that was recommended in part 1 of the National Food Strategy. If you recall, that was looked at trade and Britain's trading relationships. And I think we've seen since then that the government hasn't really taken those on board. We've got dodgy trade deals going on with Australia, for example, that a lot of farmers are very concerned are going to end up undercutting their products with products that are imported from places that have lower, for example, animal welfare standards. So that's been reiterated in this part, and we'll see in the white paper whether that's been taken on board. And then finally, the 4th theme is about creating a long-term shift in our food culture. And this one I find a little bit missed, but it's quite big recommendations that contain a lot of aspects. So first of all, investing 1 billion in innovation to create a better food system. There's different components to that. I think one of the interesting ones is about guaranteeing funding for alternative proteins research to try and move away from things like ruminant livestock. And then number 12 is about creating a national food system data program. So the idea here is to increase the amount of data available, but also the navigability and the transparency so that people can actually make use of it and use these system type approaches to identify sort of these destructive feedback loops and things. Number 13 is about public procurement. So making sure that food served in places like hospitals, schools and prisons is healthy and sustainable, because that's a huge amount of the food consumed in this country every day. And then finally, recommendation 14 is about setting clear targets and bringing in legislation for long-term change. And this is about having a good food bill, which will do various things. Among them, it's going to be about expanding the remit of the Food Standards Agency to set out or to renew our guidelines around what is a healthy and sustainable diet, and making sure that they report annually to government and things like that. I can go in a bit more detail with that later if you'd like. So I'm just going to skip over these slides about the devolved nations, but if you want to know more about them, we can look at that later. Scotland does have a good food nation policy, but it's could be strengthened according to different NGOs. Scotland's also introducing free school meals, universal free school meals this year. Wales has a sustainable farming scheme being co-designed and a food bill being drafted, and they're to introduce free school meals within 3 years, only for primary school children. And then in Northern Ireland, there's a food strategy framework consultation that was launched in late 2021. And they're still sort of wrangling, as far as I'm aware, over, there's 2 competing climate change bills going through the Assembly at the moment. So we'll see which one of those, whether it's the more, the one that wants us to be at net zero sooner, or the one that wants us to be not quite at net zero a bit later. Okay, so we got together with some colleagues from the CCRI and beyond on the 10th of September to discuss it, the National Food Strategy, and this is just a link to the blog where we have a summary of what we discussed. And I'll just pick out some of the major things, and then I'll pass back to Damian, who's going to speak a bit more about how things are looking now. So a major point with the National Food Strategy is the scope of it. It's absolutely huge, both in terms of how long the report is and like how many different silos it tries to sort of bridge and aspects that it tries to bring together. And we really liked the use of systems thinking as a way to get to grips with this. But we did question, can the government react in a similarly holistic way when a lot of the way of dealing with these things is in these quite calcified silos. So it remains to be seen what that's going to look like, the implementation aspect of this. And then we also talked about how we can communicate these complex strategies. So much work goes into them, and they cover so many aspects, but then what gets the headline is stuff about taxes, sugar and salt taxes. Sometimes they talk about meat taxes. And you see this with even with big IPCC reports, that it's reduced down to like one very narrow view. And how do we communicate these complicated things in a way that's inspiring and engaging for citizens? And that also relates to our own research too. So I mentioned about land use and about this 3-compartment model. So basically this is about having 3 different types of land use. So taking some areas out of food production and rewilding them, and then having the rest split between these very low input agroecological farms, so sort of farming in harmony with nature type thing, and then also having these very high tech sort of productivist farms. So it sort of sidesteps the whole debate over land sparing versus land sharing and says we should do all of it. And we queried whether that was a bit just not, kind of hedging your bets, and how that would actually look in practice. Like, what is that going to mean on the ground? Are you actually going to have a farm with drones sitting next to a farm that's mixed agroecological, agroforestry and all these things? Like, how is that going to work? And this feeds into broader questions about how we use the land and actually who gets to decide how we use the land, which wasn't really sort of addressed so much in the report. And then briefly, the citizen engagement aspect of the NFS had to be scaled back due to COVID. There was originally going to be a citizens assembly as part of it, and they were able to do a lot. They did a lot of impressive engagement strategies, and they held these deliberative dialogues all around the country, which seems to have been very successful. And we just question whether, had that not been the case, and could that more deliberation have made things a little bit more joined up and allowed that articulation of values and sort of shared imagination of different solutions to come through a little bit more and be a little bit more impactful. And this also led to reflections on our own research, how we can increase participation and how we include silent voices in the work that we do. So with that, I'll hand back to Damian to talk a bit more about reflections on the strategy at this point, as we sort of await with bated breath the release of the white paper.
Thanks, Pippa. That was really good. So yeah, I mean, as you can see, actually, there's an awful lot in the strategy, and Pippa and I have gone back into the recommendations, particularly chapter 16, and kind of looked at it in quite a lot of detail, and it takes quite a bit of going over to see all the stuff that's in it. But so what we've done as well is sort of try and step back a bit further and sort of think, you know, what do we make of it, basically? And I think it's clearly a very thorough and detailed piece of work, with quite a lot of, you've got the 14 recommendations, then specific actions within them. And we like this kind of attempt to bring in a kind of more systems dynamics framing, which comes from the work of people like, you know, Donella Meadows and people like that, you know, proper systems thinkers. So that's really, really quite brave, I think, and to be applauded. These are offered kind of as not critiques as such, but things that struck us as potentially worthy of discussion. And the first one is probably the one that I would probably challenge them on the most if I was asked to comment on the strategy publicly. And it's the way that the question, I think, of inequality is addressed in the document. So they have a chapter on inequality, which is not very long. And one of the statements that they make in there is that it's not their job to comment on the provision of social safety nets. And there is no explicit mention in the document of anything about, for example, the need for a right to food. And so that said, there's a great deal in it in terms of specific recommendations. So that second theme that Pippa introduced, which is about inequality, is there. But what's missing for us is more this kind of overarching message of the need to address essentially poverty, because food poverty is part of poverty. So we don't really go along with that argument in that chapter, and we think they've missed a trick there a little bit, or they've made a political decision not to go there, which we think is a real shame, because you can't say we're going to focus on climate change, we're going to focus on nature. Whoa, that poverty stuff, that's too difficult, we'll leave that. If you're properly doing systems dynamics, that it's all interconnected. You know, food poverty is connected with poverty. If you've got poverty, you've got more likelihood of eating effectively pretty rubbish food, no matter what food environment you build. So that's a big criticism, I think, actually. The second thing, which is quite interesting, is going back to those previous food strategies that we had. Actually, there's quite a lot of interventionist calls in the proposal, which is quite interesting. So it makes quite a lot of recommendations for government intervention and for mechanisms to improve accountability and sort of, you know, the way that companies report and stuff. And it is very good, I think, in sort of showing up this tension between, you know, potentially shifting to a low carbon agri-food economy in the UK, but that not being undermined by standards. So that's quite a good point, I think. A third reflection when we were thinking about it was that there isn't actually any mention of the food environment concept, which again might be quite a helpful thing to think through, particularly when you start to think about things like the junk food cycle, for example. So the food environment is effectively this kind of interface between the food system and people, and it kind of shifts away from you know, responsibilizing individual consumer choice. So that could be quite an interesting concept. In terms of this 3-compartment model, which Pippa explained really well, for us, it's quite a fuzzy part of both the strategy itself and also the recommendations. So there's kind of recommendations to build this land use framework, for instance, but it seems to be missing a kind of, it's almost quite abstract in a way. And when you start to kind of put that down on land use, on farming identities, on rural communities and stuff, you know, are we going to end up with this kind of patchwork that they're imagining? I'm not so sure. So I think that needs quite a lot of working through. And then our final reflection is linked to public procurement, but also localism more broadly. So it's fantastic that public procurement features as a strong recommendation, and the rollout of things like the dynamic procurement system is great. What is striking though is that kind of local and localism is treated almost in a kind of quite a cautious sort of way. And I think it's kind of undervalued and at best implicit in some of the recommendations. But if you go back to part 1, there's quite a strange statement about localism equaling kind of self-sufficiency and what happened in the Irish potato famine and stuff. And that's kind of seeped into the second part of the plan, and they've completely misunderstood what localism is actually about. It's not this kind of spatially bounded construct. So therefore, they've missed a trick, I think, in terms of thinking about localism as a more kind of distributed food economy, localism to build community well-being and that sort of stuff. There's a little bit of it hinted at, but it's completely, it's like they made a decision not to go there with it, which is quite disappointing, I think, from my perspective at least. So they were our kind of wider reflections, and that's, I think, so we've gone on for about 26 minutes, so I'll stop there, but hopefully that's been helpful to everybody in terms of giving you a sense of what's in it.